Ibrahim Traoré, the young and stoic leader known for his unwavering composure, found himself at a rare loss for words as Representative Jasmine Crockett delivered a speech that stirred every corner of the room and every conscience within it. Her voice, clear and unwavering, cut through the atmosphere like a blade of truth, commanding attention not with force but with authenticity. From the moment she took the floor, there was a shift in energy. Crockett did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The depth of her conviction spoke volumes on its own. Every word was measured, deliberate, yet overflowing with raw emotion. She spoke not as a politician, but as a vessel of lived experience, tapping into the deeper pulse of justice, truth, and accountability. Traoré, who had endured battlefields both literal and political, was visibly struck. His usual expression, calm, reserved, calculating, betrayed a crack. For the first time in many observers' memory, the Burkinabe captain-turned-president wasn't leading the moment. He was feeling it. Crockett's speech was not scripted for applause, it was not laced with political theater. Instead, it unraveled with a haunting honesty. She spoke of pain, historic pain, generational pain, the kind carried quietly by too many for too long. She gave voice to stories silenced by systems, to faces overlooked by power. Her cadence was rhythmic, her pauses powerful, her words unflinching. She recalled names, moments, and movements. Not in passing, but with reverence. She challenged silence and complicity. Her message was not aimed to divide, but to illuminate. She made it clear that justice must be more than a slogan. It must be a structure lived and enforced. As the weight of her words settled over the room, the silence was not uncomfortable. It was reverent. Even those who came into the space indifferent were now leaning in. Traoré, often the one others looked to for reassurance or resistance, now found himself reflecting, deeply. The camera caught him once, briefly closing his eyes as if replaying the lines in his mind, processing the emotional current she had unleashed. What struck him, and everyone present, was that Crockett did not frame herself as a savior. Instead, she stood as a mirror reflecting a reality that many choose to ignore, yet one that demands recognition. Her vulnerability became a force. Her story, though personal, felt universal. She did not beg for empathy. She summoned responsibility. There was a moment, perhaps just seconds, but felt like an eternity, when she paused, her eyes meeting Traoré's across the room. No words exchanged. None were needed. Something had landed. Something had shifted. When she concluded, the applause did not erupt. It built slowly like a wave rising after a calm. It was not performative. It was respectful. It was the kind of applause born out of understanding, of gratitude, of awe. Traoré did not immediately respond, and that, in itself, was a response. The man known for decisive speeches, for sharp counters, and principled stances remained still. His silence spoke of a mind recalibrating, of a heart moved, perhaps unexpectedly. He had come prepared for a dialogue. He was now wrestling with a monologue that touched more than just politics. This moment, unrehearsed, unguarded, reminded everyone present that speeches don't just inform or persuade. Sometimes they transform. Crockett hadn't simply addressed a room. She had altered its rhythm. And in doing so, she revealed something profoundly human in a man rarely seen vulnerable. For Traoré, the words may fade with time, but the echo of that silence will stay. As the final words of Jasmine Crockett's speech lingered in the room like incense, heavy, unshakable, Ibrahim Traoré remained motionless. His fingers, usually clasped with military precision, now rested loosely against each other. He wasn't simply listening anymore. He was remembering, recalling his own past, the streets of Ouagadougou, the resistance movements, the voices that had once called him to action. And yet, none of them had struck the same chord as this. Crockett had not spoken about Burkina Faso. Her message was rooted in her own nation's struggle, but that was the brilliance of her words. They transcended borders. She had excavated a truth so universal that even a foreign president thousands of miles from her political context couldn't escape its resonance. Observers noted a distinct stillness in the air, the kind that descends only after something irreversible has been said. In that room, filled with diplomats, analysts, journalists, and aides, time seemed suspended. For Traoré, a man of strategy and action, this was unfamiliar terrain. He was not reacting, he was feeling. Later, when aides gently approached him, their voices low with respect, Traoré simply nodded. "Give me a moment," he said, softly but firmly. It was a request not just for silence but for space. Space to process what had just unfolded. Outside the chamber, murmurs swelled. Some questioned what this moment would mean politically. Others sensed it was something deeper, harder to measure. One advisor remarked that it was the first time they had seen the president visibly moved. Another said they had never seen a speech turn into a mirror quite so sharply. But for Crockett, it was never about making a man like Traoré speechless. Her goal had not been disruption. It had been reflection. And it landed. Her words had gone past his title, past the layers of protocol and pride, and struck something quietly human in him. In the days that followed, Traoré did not speak publicly about the moment, but his tone in subsequent meetings shifted. There was a gravity to him, not just as a soldier or a statesman, but as a man wrestling with more than policy. His private remarks to close allies began to include phrases like responsibility to listen and power as a burden, not a crown. It was as if Crockett's voice had not only pierced his defenses but redefined some internal compass. The world may remember the headlines, that a powerful speech silenced a president. But the real story unfolded beneath that surface. It was about what happens when truth confronts power, not with aggression but with moral clarity. When conviction crosses oceans and finds a pulse in an unexpected place. Jasmine Crockett did not just speak that day. She changed the architecture of the room. She proved that the right words, delivered at the right time, can disarm even the most fortified spirits, not through shame, but through undeniable truth. And for Ibrahim Traoré, the silence she left him with may well be the most lasting part of all. In the aftermath, something subtle but unmistakable began to shift around Ibrahim Traoré. Though he returned to his duties, the tempo of his leadership took on a new timbre. Meetings were quieter, more contemplative. His responses, once quick and decisive, now carried an added weight, as though he were weighing not only political implications but the human consequences behind each choice. Privately, his inner circle noticed a change in the types of questions he began asking. He no longer spoke solely in terms of national security or economic strategy. He began probing deeper into the lives behind the data. Women displaced by conflict, young men disenfranchised by systems they didn't create, and voices on the margins that policy had too long ignored. One evening, Traoré requested a detailed report on grassroots movements in West Africa, those led not by politicians or generals but by ordinary people. He wanted to understand them. "They speak without privilege," he reportedly said to an aide, echoing the very essence of Crockett's address. And sometimes, that's where truth lives. Crockett's impact didn't end within the chamber's walls. Footage of the speech went viral within hours. Activists across continents found resonance in her words. Across social media, young Africans, Americans, and diasporic voices began drawing parallels between their struggles, recognizing shared threads of injustice, resilience, and urgency. The speech had not just spoken to a moment, it had awakened a movement. Back in Washington, Crockett was asked repeatedly about the moment Traoré fell silent. She always answered with humility. It wasn't about silencing anyone, she said. It was about speaking from where it hurts, and hoping someone truly listens. She didn't boast. She didn't need to. The integrity of her message had already rippled far beyond any podium. In the weeks that followed, a quiet correspondence began between the two. It wasn't publicized or politicized. It was private, personal. Traoré, in a handwritten note, thanked her for what he called a truth that demanded my stillness. He confessed that her words had shaken assumptions he didn't realize he still carried, and that leadership, he now understood more fully, sometimes meant being humble enough to hear. Crockett, in turn, wrote back, "If even one person in power truly listens, then the words were worth it." That exchange, though unseen by the public, became emblematic of something larger. The power of dialogue born not from dominance but from honesty, from empathy, from courage. Months later, during an international forum on equitable development, Traoré referenced a moment that had taught him the value of uncomfortable truths. He didn't name Crockett. He didn't need to. Everyone who had witnessed that day understood the reference. And perhaps more importantly, they saw its effect, because real transformation doesn't always explode. It unfolds, quietly, slowly, authentically. Jasmine Crockett didn't set out to make headlines. She set out to speak a truth she could no longer carry alone. And in doing so, she sparked a shift in a man who many thought untouchable by sentiment. Ibrahim Traoré may never speak about that moment in detail, but it's clear now. He was not left broken by her words. He was left open. And in that openness, something rare happened. A leader listened not because he was told to, but because he couldn't ignore what he heard. As the months passed, the moment that had once seemed like a fleeting disruption in a high-level political gathering grew into something more enduring, an inflection point. Though no formal declaration marked the change, it became evident across Traoré's policies, his demeanor, and even in his public speeches. He had absorbed Jasmine Crockett'S message in a way few had anticipated. In a televised national address, he spoke directly to the youth of Burkina Faso, not with lofty rhetoric, but with something closer to vulnerability. "We have built our movements on strength," he said, "but we must also build them on compassion. Power, if it cannot feel the people, will eventually fail them." It was not the language of a hardened soldier. It was the reflection of a man reshaped by truth. International observers began to take notice. Traoré initiated a series of forums not just with officials, but with civil society groups, especially those led by women and youth. These weren't mere photo opportunities. He sat, listened, and occasionally deferred decisions pending community input. One activist, after meeting with him, said he wasn't there to defend a position, he was there to learn, and that's not the man I expected. Back in the United States, Crockett's profile rose, but rather than ride the wave of viral fame, she grounded herself more firmly in her work. When asked about the encounter months later during a policy summit, she said simply, "If my words helped light even one lantern in a dark hallway, then I've done my job. But the light has to stay on through action, not applause." Behind the scenes, a quiet alliance began forming between advisors in Burkina Faso and Crockett's office, not on grand geopolitical strategy, but on social reform, education access, anti-corruption measures, gender equity. It was informal, human, and born not of protocol, but of mutual purpose. They weren't just exchanging policy ideas. They were building a new political vocabulary rooted in shared values. Traoré's transformation didn't go unchallenged. Critics accused him of softening, of drifting too far from the revolutionary fervor that had elevated him to power. Some said he was being influenced by foreign ideals. But Traoré, in a press conference, dismissed the notion with characteristic calm. To listen is not to surrender. It is to lead with eyes wide open. The people deserve a leader who listens before he speaks. Those closest to him knew the truth. It wasn't about ideology. It was about clarity. Crockett's speech had not rewritten his beliefs. It had sharpened them. It reminded him that courage is not always found in confrontation. It's often found in reflection. When the two leaders finally met again, quietly away from cameras and headlines, it was not as speaker and audience, but as peers. There were no grand declarations, just an exchange of understanding, of mutual recognition, and in that, a kind of quiet power. The world will always remember that Jasmine Crockett'S speech left Ibrahim Traoré speechless. But history may remember what followed more, a leader unafraid to evolve and a voice powerful enough to awaken that evolution. Some speeches make noise, others make history. This one did both. Their second meeting, held in a modest conference room in Accra during a regional summit, was entirely off the record. No flashing cameras, no press releases, just two individuals who had felt the weight of a shared moment months before, now, sitting across from each other as equals. Traoré entered first, expression calm but introspective. When Crockett stepped in, he rose, not out of ceremony but out of respect. The handshake between them was firm, but it wasn't the grip of politicians playing for optics. It was quiet recognition. "I never got to thank you properly," Traoré said, his voice lower, more personal than his usual public cadence. "Your words reached a part of me that many tried to touch but couldn't." Crockett nodded, offering no victory in her smile, just warmth. "It wasn't about you, Ibrahim," she replied, "but I'm glad it found you anyway." They spoke for over an hour, not of power plays or strategic alliances, but of purpose, of leadership in the modern world, of what it means to represent people who often never get the luxury of being heard. Traoré shared stories of young organizers in Burkina Faso who had challenged him, pushed him. Crockett listened, encouraged, and offered insight, not as a diplomat, but as someone who had walked that same uncertain bridge between community and institution. By the end of the meeting, nothing formal had been signed. No headline-grabbing initiative had been born, and yet what passed between them was something rare, a commitment to truth in leadership, not performative, not political, but deeply personal. That encounter sparked something unexpected, a wave of joint workshops between African and American community leaders, young, grassroots, grounded. Initiatives grew, not under the names of governments, but under banners like People First and Voices Beyond Borders. They focused on storytelling, policy training, and building sustainable local institutions. And while neither Crockett nor Traoré publicly took credit, insiders knew where the momentum had begun. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré continued to surprise even his allies. He pushed for broader civil participation in constitutional reform debates. He invited critics to open forums, aired nationally, giving dissenting voices a platform, an unheard-of move in the region. When asked why, he simply said, "Leadership that fears criticism is leadership that fears the people." Meanwhile, Crockett's authenticity, already admired in Washington, began to draw international praise. She was invited to speak at the United Nations, not as a politician, but as a truth-teller. In her address, she never once mentioned the moment with Traoré, but those who had followed it closely understood the heartbeat behind her closing words. "If our voices don't echo through action, then they are only noise. Let us speak to move, not to be heard, but to be felt." And she had been felt, not just in one chamber, not just by one man, but across borders and boundaries once thought too rigid to bend, a voice that crossed oceans and reshaped a nation's posture. Ibrahim Traoré was not transformed by defeat, nor was Jasmine Crockett elevated by conquest. What they shared was rarer, a moment of radical honesty and the courage to carry it forward. In the end, history would record the speech, the silence, the shift. But long after the moment faded from headlines, what remained was its aftermath. A deep, sustained breath in the ongoing fight for dignified leadership. A reminder that sometimes the greatest power lies not in commanding a room but in letting it change you. Months turned into a year, and yet the reverberations of that singular moment, when a voice pierced through power and left silence in its wake, continued to shape not only two political careers, but also a growing movement anchored in accountability and moral clarity. Across Burkina Faso, something remarkable began to happen. The population, long accustomed to seeing leadership as a remote force, began to feel seen. Town halls became commonplace. Radio programs began inviting farmers, teachers, market women, and students to share concerns live, unfiltered. Government ministers were required to hold quarterly listening sessions in rural areas. And while the policies didn't change overnight, the culture around power had started to bend. Traoré no longer operated with the detached precision of a military strategist alone. He spoke more often of inclusion, of legacy, and of making space for younger voices. His leadership matured, not weakened, through empathy. When journalists pressed him on his change in tone, he answered without hesitation. Sometimes the strongest decision a leader can make is to step out of the spotlight and listen from the shadows, not to control the narrative, but to understand. And across the ocean, Crockett continued to walk the difficult line between principled firebrand and effective legislator. She refused to be boxed in by conventional politics, constantly returning to the grassroots for direction, for grounding. Her office became a revolving door for organizers, educators, faith leaders, people whose hands were calloused by the work of building real change. She often referenced unnamed moments in speeches and interviews. When power meets purpose, she would say, it either hardens or it opens. And what the world needs now is not tougher leaders, it needs braver ones. She never exploited the moment with Traoré, never turned it into a personal brand. And perhaps that's what made it so powerful. Because the truth is, the most profound shifts rarely need spotlights. They need only sincerity and space. Then came an invitation, quietly extended by Traoré to Crockett, to deliver the keynote at a summit in Ouagadougou, focused on youth leadership and democratic reform across the Sahel. There was no pomp, no diplomatic chest-puffing, just a mutual understanding. Her voice had helped spark something, and now others needed to feel that same jolt. When she took the stage that evening, there was no teleprompter. Just her, a small note card in her hand, and thousands of young faces watching, waiting. She spoke less about politics and more about possibility. Change doesn't come when we wait for the right title. It comes when we speak, even if our voice shakes. It comes when we stop asking for permission to feel, to lead, to demand more. She paused, scanning the crowd, her eyes finding Traoré seated in the front row, not with the stiffness of a head of state, but with the attentiveness of a student. Last year, I spoke from pain, and someone listened. That's all it takes. One moment of truth, one ear willing to hear it, one silence that turns into action. The applause that followed was thunderous, not because she had spoken loudly, but because she had reminded them that transformation doesn't begin in palaces or parliaments. It begins in people, in boldness, in brutal honesty. In the days that followed, the summit birthed new youth-led initiatives, regional coalitions, and a renewed commitment to integrity and leadership across several West African states. Traoré quietly funded new scholarship programs and community journalism initiatives. Crockett helped connect them to U.S.-based advocacy training and international NGOs. What began as an unplanned, emotional speech had become a model, a case study in how truth, when spoken with courage and received with humility, can dismantle the distance between power and the people. Years from now, that moment may be summarized in textbooks or quoted in leadership seminars. But those who lived it, those who witnessed it unfold, and those who followed its ripple, will remember it for what it truly was. Not a clash, not a victory, but a reckoning, a turning point, a testament to the fact that the right words, spoken from the soul, can still change the world. As the years moved forward, the ripple became a tide. In Burkina Faso, the reforms that had once seemed symbolic began to embed themselves deeply into the institutions of governance. Community-based oversight councils were established, allowing citizens direct input on local budgets and development plans. Whistleblower protections were strengthened and media censorship laws were loosened to allow for more critical voices. It was not perfect, no system ever is, but it was progress rooted in trust, and that trust could be traced back to the quiet power of a moment between two unlikely allies. And though Traoré never became a radically different man, he became something rarer, a leader willing to evolve. He still held the military's respect, still spoke with the sharp cadence of command when needed. But within that sharpness, there was softness, a measured grace that gave weight to his authority, without dimming its clarity. His cabinet, once stacked with loyalists, gradually opened to include reformers and community advocates. His speeches, still firm, now carried the undercurrent of someone who had heard and never unheard. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, rose in stature not through spectacle, but through consistency. Her refusal to politicize her moment of influence earned her the respect of allies and adversaries alike. She became a bridge, not only between communities and Congress, but between nations and values. When foreign leaders came to Washington, seeking genuine dialogue, her name often surfaced, not for what she could deliver in votes, but for the clarity she brought to conversations clouded by political fog. She never stopped citing the importance of that silence, not to glorify it, but to remind others of its potential, that the deepest impact isn't always made when someone shouts, it's made when someone feels. And the world began to pay attention. A new model of diplomacy quietly emerged, one that leaned on personal truth, shared humanity and emotional intelligence as much as on treaties and protocol. Other leaders, from Latin America to Southeast Asia, started citing the Traoré-Crockett dialogue in panels and think tank papers, not as a formal policy exchange, but as a turning point in how we understand transformative leadership. Documentary, The Silence Between Words, chronicled the full arc of their exchange. It premiered at film festivals across continents, highlighting how a single speech, delivered not for power but from purpose, ignited a series of changes across borders. Viewers weren't just inspired, they were activated. Young activists in Ghana, Colombia, and rural Mississippi held community screenings followed by town halls. The film became less about two public figures and more about reclaiming the belief that words, courageously spoken and vulnerably received, still matter. Eventually, Crockett was honored at the Carter Center with a citation for global civic integrity. When asked to reflect on the journey, she simply said, "It was never about making someone speechless. It was about making someone stop long enough to remember why they were speaking in the first place." And Traoré, speaking later that year at a Pan-African Youth Leadership Summit, echoed her sentiment. "I used to believe the loudest voice in the room was the strongest. Now I know. It's the voice that makes you pause, reconsider, and choose. Better that truly leads." And in that shared philosophy, spoken continents apart but in perfect harmony, history found its closing stanza. What began as a moment became a movement, not of ideology, not of ambition, but of awakened conscience. And that more than any treaty or title became their true legacy. As the legacy of that moment continued to unfold, it no longer belonged solely to Ibrahim Traoré or Jasmine Crockett. It became a living thread woven into the fabric of a new generation of leadership, one that believed not just in vision, but in vulnerability, not just in conviction, but in connection. Educational institutions across Africa and the U.S. began integrating the Traoré-Crockett exchange into curricula, not just as a political case study, but as a lesson in emotional intelligence, ethical courage, and the dynamics of human-centered governance. Leadership seminars dissected the cadence of Crockett's delivery, the stillness of Traoré's reaction, and the unseen psychological shift that followed. It was no longer analyzed as a confrontation, but as a breakthrough. In Burkina Faso, students began to quote lines from Crockett's speech as mantras of civic engagement. A youth-led initiative dubbed From Silence Action trained young orators, policy writers, and grassroots organizers on how to wield truth with both fire and grace. Traoré himself attended the launch, not as a guest of honor, but as a mentor. He sat among the students listening more than speaking, nodding as they shared their ideas and frustrations, as if he, too, was still learning. And perhaps that was his greatest transformation, not the change in policy, not the public reforms, but the private decision to remain open, teachable, and responsive to truth. In the U.S., Crockett launched a fellowship program in her district called the Stillness Initiative, designed to cultivate reflective leadership in young professionals, especially those from underserved communities. This is where our power starts, she told the first cohort. Not in rhetoric, in reflection, in listening, in building what we wish someone else had built for us. The program's symbol, a single circle of concentric sound waves emerging from a point of silence, came to represent a philosophy that spread far beyond her office walls. By the 5th anniversary of that fateful moment, a joint statement, brief, elegant, and handwritten, was released by both leaders. We did not plan the moment, but we honored it, and we chose to walk forward, not away, from each other and from the truth it carried. Let this be a reminder. Real leadership doesn't fear being moved. It fears standing still. That statement, released without ceremony, went viral once again. Not because it shocked, but because it resonated. Because in a world saturated with performance, people still craved sincerity. And by then it was clear. That moment had evolved into more than a spark. It had become a mirror, held up to leaders around the world, asking not, "What will you say?" but "Will you be moved?" In quiet classrooms, crowded rallies, tense boardrooms, and bustling townships, the legacy lived on, in every young voice that dared to speak truth to power, and in every powerful ear that chose to listen. The story of Jasmine Crockett and Ibrahim Traoré was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to all who believe that even in the noise of the world, one moment of silence, honest, raw, and reckoned with, can start a revolution. Years later, that revolution of silence and listening became a beacon for leaders across continents. When crises erupted, from climate disasters to political unrest, many found themselves recalling the lesson Crockett and Traoré unwittingly taught, that leadership grounded in empathy and openness could navigate chaos more effectively than force alone. In international forums, young diplomats often cited the exchange as a turning point in modern diplomacy, one that proved dialogue could be transformative when it was rooted in genuine understanding rather than mere protocol. The spirit of that moment fueled new peace-building initiatives, emphasizing storytelling and mutual respect between opposing parties. Meanwhile, grassroots organizations took inspiration from the legacy to cultivate spaces where marginalized voices could be heard, and where those in power would be challenged not with anger but with persistent, heartfelt truth. For Crockett and Traoré, the journey was never about personal accolades. Their bond, forged in silence and strengthened through shared conviction, remained a quiet testament to the power of authenticity and leadership. They continued to walk their separate paths, but always with a mutual respect that transcended politics. And, perhaps the most profound truth of all was this: in a world too often defined by division, the courage to listen, to truly listen, could bridge even the widest divides. Because sometimes, the most revolutionary act is to pause, to reflect, to let the silence speak and then choose to be changed by what it says. In the end, the story of Ibrahim Traoré and Jasmine Crockett is not just about two individuals or a single speech. It is about the transformative power that lies in moments of vulnerability and genuine connection. A reminder that leadership is not about commanding attention, but about awakening the humanity in others. Their encounter showed the world that change begins when someone dares to speak truth boldly, and another dares to listen deeply. From that shared silence grew a movement, a renewed faith in the possibility that leaders can be both strong and compassionate, decisive and open. Long after the applause faded and the headlines turned, the legacy of that day endured. In classrooms, where young leaders learn to listen before they speak, in communities where voices once ignored now shape their own futures, and in the hearts of all who believe that the greatest power is the courage to be changed. Because sometimes, the most profound revolutions don't roar, they whisper, and in those whispers history is made.